Du vin. Better than food, man. Bonjour à tous. Good evening. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Cliff Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. I have something very overdue for y'all today. Fleurs de Mal and selected poems by Charles Baudelaire. And I am having a drink. Out of Italian silver. Italian wine out of Italian silver. Isn't that something? I was just talking about silver in Tanizaki's In Praise of Shadows, where he was discussing the Eastern affinity for silver that has gained this, patina with age, as opposed to the Western affinity for polished silver. And I've never owned any silver in my life, but my wife just brought me this present home from work, from the free bin. It's actual Italian silver. It's cool. So before we get started, I just want to mention something. I'm going to try an experiment suggested by a patron of the show. I get a lot of book recommendations, a lot, and they all look awesome, but it's going to take me a very long time to get to all of them. So if you'd like to make a donation to the show, I will move your recommendation up the pipeline. Seems like it might solve a couple of problems, keeps the show going, and you, the very kind viewer and patron, get to see the book you would like reviewed faster. And of course, if it's a book that is very popular and it's been recommended a lot, you're going to make a lot of people happy. So that's awesome. And if you're interested in doing that and supporting the show, then please shoot me a message at the email in the description box, and I really appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you to everyone for all the recommendations. In 3 days it will be fall, and so I thought this was a perfect book for the beginning of the season. So one of my patrons and I were discussing the damned poets. And referring to Charles Baudelaire, she said, "He's the damnedest of all the damned." My God, where do we start? With wine. Baudelaire loved wine. He loved writing poetry about wine. He wrote quite a bit of poetry about wine. Shows up a lot. He wrote a famous poem called Be Drunk, which I don't think is in this collection, but the last line of that was, "To escape the fate of those tormented slaves of time, get drunk. Drink deep, never ceasing. Whether wine, poetry, or virtue, the choice is yours." Baudelaire was drunk at different times on all three, I imagine. And it's about being enraptured with life, being drunk on life, as opposed to just being an alcoholic. But, that's kind of par for the course within his circle as well, as we'll see. But it reveals what Baudelaire was all about. Plunging into the intensity of life, often through the loss of self. You could say Baudelaire practiced and perfected the art of radical indulgence, rebellious indulgence, which inspired and was elaborated on by artists and poets forever onward up to the present day. Baudelaire saw the beauty in sin and attempted to convey it in poetry. Provocative, scandalous, debauched, radical, and paradoxical, because it's also quiet, tranquil, meditative, benevolent, somber, and anxious. It's confessional. It's open like a bleeding wound, right? Charles Baudelaire was one of the greatest French poets of the 19th century. He was part of the decadent literary movement and played a role in the evolution from Romanticism to modernism. He had a huge influence on modern poetry. Baudelaire was Proust's favorite poet. Decadence was a literary movement in the 19th century inspired by Gothic literature and Edgar Allan Poe. Started by Baudelaire and then cemented by Weselyn, who wrote Against Nature, which is an amazing book. Highly recommended. I did a terrible review of it, but you should read it nonetheless. Maybe I'll re-review that one day. But cemented by Weselyn and the Fin de Siècle writers. This is considered by some to be the first decadent work. Fleurs de Mal is Baudelaire's first collection of poems and his most famous. He was a contradiction. He was part of the Romantic poets and he was a dandy. Then sometimes a bohemian, which is a term that comes from Eastern European gypsies. Kind of that style of free living, like not having a lot of money, but being able to live life how you want to. The dandies were ostentatious in their clothing and attitudes, often mimicking the aristocracy, even though they didn't have any money. Big hat, no cattle kind of thing. The bohemians were understated and loathed money, but they cherished freedom and pleasure. Baudelaire was among some of the first Western writers to write about their experiences using psychoactive drugs, such as hashish, and opium too, I believe, but definitely hashish with Gautier. They'd eat it with coffee. Eat it in like a paste. They didn't smoke it. So that sounded like a fun party to be invited to. Romantic poets, hashish, and coffee. Yeah, that's a good time. It was a sick, intense, dramatic period. And this is revealed in his poetry, the themes of which are death, the devil, the sun, wine, anguish, eroticism, melancholy, tragedy, beauty, wine. I've read he was a Catholic later in life, though how much, to what degree, couldn't say. There is a strong religious element in his poetry. Again, I think there's that contradictory element, right? Wanting to go in both directions, salvation and damnation. Maybe his salvation was damnation. Maybe our salvation was his damnation. Because I definitely think we got the best part of the deal in this one. Because his life wasn't too great. Writing poetry for Baudelaire, like Rimbaud, just didn't really do much to enhance their quality of life, I don't think. Or so it seems. But we'll talk about that. When he was young in his dandy chapter, he spent his inheritance, a lot of his inheritance, on clothing and stuff until his inheritance was taken away from him by his parents. And then he became impoverished and bitter, and he had to beg his mother for money for the rest of his life, or at least it seemed for some lengthy period of time afterwards. He was a dissolute poet and a dandy mama's boy. He lived in extravagant debt, as this article says, which I've linked to in the description box below. His father died when he was young. His father was much older than his mother, and his mom remarried, and she married a general, or a guy who would eventually be a general. And Baudelaire hated his military stepfather, General Opique, who seemed to represent to him conservative, oppressive authority. So after he spends like half his inheritance or something like that, just like going crazy, living it up, his parents stick him on a ship to India to try and rid him of his bad habits. And that does not work at all. It just gives him this zeal and lust for life and experience. And so he comes right back to Paris and he starts hobnobbing with everybody and goes into a career in literature. He began seeing this woman named Jeanne Duval, a Haitian-born actress who became his muse and inspired his poetry. Manet was actually a friend of Baudelaire's and painted her. Baudelaire's parents rejected their relationship, and this must have been pretty hard for him because after that he tried to kill himself. So I'm stealing this story from a Weselyn Lecture, which I've linked to in the description box below. And, we don't know if this is true or not, but it's a great story. So Baudelaire was part of the 1848 revolution, and the story goes like this. All of them have their guns and they're running in the streets, and Baudelaire's with them, and they're like, where shall we start the revolution? Where shall we start? Where shall we start? Where shall we go? What shall we do? And Baudelaire's like, General Opique. We have to kill General Opique. It's his stepfather, right? I could just see that being one of the best parts of the Baudelaire biopic. For some reason, I feel like he should be played by Richard E. Grant, or maybe a ruling class era Peter O'Toole. Opique was in fact a high-ranking officer in the French army, who became Louis Napoleon's ambassador to Constantinople and Madrid. Really impressive figure, actually. You see, after the revolution, Napoleon took over, so it failed. The revolution was a failure. So after the revolution, Napoleon takes control, and Paris changes physically. And this shift informs Baudelaire's poetry. That's sort of what it's about. It's about this displacement, this existential displacement. He's all about disruption, derangement of the senses in search of the ideal. You can totally see how Rimbaud was taking notes. Get drunk. Really drunk. Right. Have dirty poet sex with Verlaine. All the great authors have daddy issues and strange relationships with their mothers, it seems. Mishima, Rimbaud, Baudelaire, Bataille, and all of those guys are contradictions, total contradictions, and they can all write one hell of a good book or poetry or whatever. I think the energy from that inner conflict is what creates the intensity in the art we most respond to. It's dangerous. It does sacrifice morality for intensity in search of an authentic art, passionate, irrational, confrontational, and totally unapologetic. Baudelaire was also a fan of Poe and translated his short stories. How he discovered him is amazing. I don't know how that happened, and I would love to know if anybody could tell me. It's fascinating that at that time, these two souls could find each other, It's a match made in hell. Baudelaire was a contrarian. a flaneur who wandered around without a goal. He and Fleurs were prosecuted as an outrage to public decency. Things were stuffy in art at that time. You had to do things a certain way in France, or people were appalled. It seemed easier at that time to offend people. For example, Victor Hugo had this theatrical debut, and he invited all of his romantic poet friends. And so they're there, along with, you know, the upper crust, the conservative types, the well-to-do, and they premiere this play, and the romantic types had brought their wine and they were drunk by the time everything got going. And all that happened was that Hugo, in his play, carried over a rhyme from one line to the next, which was against the rules. And that caused a riot. Just that. Carrying the rhyme over from one line to the next. Riot. So it was like the young versus the old. The young blood versus the stodgy old bourgeoisie. I mean, it didn't seem like it was that hard to cause mischief, and Baudelaire was all about that. But unlike the explosive youth of Rimbaud, Baudelaire has this quiet, studied, strange, enigmatic quality. Controlled and measured in his choice of words. There's something that feels urgent and unedited about Rimbaud. Baudelaire feels like a distillation of poisonous thought into a line that is just as beautiful as it is evil. He loves writing about wine and the sea and the sun, but also about mortality and death and corpses. He's able to switch between the grotesque physical and the grotesque metaphysical. He's really something else, and it's about time we start reading from the book. Only Baudelaire could manage to make a passage about birds plunging their beaks into a corpse to eat the rotten flesh incomparably beautiful. Des féroces oiseaux perchent sous l'air pâture, des trousins avec rage en pendu déjà mûrs, chacun plaitant comme un outil son bec impur, dans tout le coin saignant de cette pourriture. My French probably sounded like something completely different, but the translation was, fierce birds perched on their food were furiously destroying a ripe, hanging corpse, each one planting his dirty beak, like an implement, in every bleeding corner of the rotten mass. So it's definitely got that Edgar Allan Poe influence. Baudelaire paid for his indulgent habits dearly, you know. It's worth noting that much of the time, we are the ones who really benefit from the poetry, not the poets. In a way, you could look at it like he sacrificed a lot to bring us this beauty. Drug abuse, excess, brain damage, paralysis, possibly syphilis, and all sorts of stuff contributed to what sounds like an absolutely appallingly miserable end for Baudelaire. He was paralyzed for the last year of his life and died in a nursing home at 46. The more I read these poems, the more I want to reread them. They have that mysterious Gothic, religious, confessional quality. They're bizarre and graphic and grotesque and beautiful and everything. Self-pitying, but at the same time empowering in that sort of Luciferian sense, you know. Make a heaven out of hell, you know, man from Paradise Lost, Milton's Lucifer. You can make the human mind can make a hell out of heaven or a heaven out of hell, that kind of thing. Proust, Rimbaud, Verlaine, Hemingway, I mean, who didn't Baudelaire influence? Henry Miller thought that Baudelaire, along with Nietzsche and along with Blake, represented this peculiar tragedy. There was this prophecy of emptiness and displacement in the struggle of modernity, the intimacy of sadness, of existential drifting, of loneliness, of meaninglessness amongst the crowd, of this intense anguish and depression, the sad and the beautiful. I discovered Baudelaire by way of Michel Houellebecq's The Elementary Particles. And when I say discovered, I mean was hit by. I never knew just how much a translation can mean everything. The quality of the translation is the difference between good or bad, effective or ineffective. And this really struck me, so I'd like to read this to you. This is just a part from his poem, Recueillement, which means meditation, although the translation in this one is a self-communion. So, sois sage, ô mort de l'heure, et tiens-toi plus tranquille. Tout réclamer le soir, il descend, le voici. Une atmosphère obscure enveloppait la ville. Aux importants la paix, aux autres les soucis. Pendant que des mortels la multitude de villes, sous les fouets du plaisir, ses bourreaux sans merci, va cueillir des rameaux dans la fête servile. Ma douleur, donne-moi la main. Viens, par ici. So this translation for that part. This is just a piece of it. It's about half. Calm down, sorrow dear, and be at peace. You said you wanted evening, it's coming. Here it is. A shadowy atmosphere is enfolding the city, bringing peace to some and to others cares. While the vile throng of mortals, flying before the whip of pleasure, that merciless torturer, goes gathering remorse in the slavish carnival, you, sorrow dear, give me your hand. Come over here. Now, okay, but it's probably, my French was terrible, but maybe if you could hear it, it sounds better in French. Now listen to the version in The Elementary Particles by Michel Houellebecq, when this character who is depressed is reading this. I believe he's teaching a class in the novel, and he reads from Baudelaire to the class. Be calm, my pain, and venture to be still. You clambered for the night. It falls, is here. The city shrouds itself in blackest chill, brings peace to some, to others fear. 'Neath pleasure's lash, the grim high executioner, mortal souls, that vile and worthless throng, reap grim remorse amidst the abject ceremony. Pain, take my hand, let us now along. Yeah, good goosebumps there. I love that last line. The city shrouds itself in blackest chill, brings peace to some, to others fear. That reminds me of Blake's Some Are Born to Sweet Delight, Some Are Born to Endless Night, which was also in Dead Man. Great film. So just that time of year. You gotta, the dark stuff. But it's my favorite. So what's the solution? Learn every damn language we can. It's about as good as I can do. Or be able to read in it, maybe at least. It's a pleasure to read Baudelaire in French and even just understand a little bit. So even if you understand just a little bit of French, just do it that way. I mean, the English is fine, but it's not, it's impossible to get the real feeling for it. I don't mean to sound snobby or anything. It's just it's kind of how it is, So who should read it? The tormented, tragic Francophiles. The enraptured, idealistic future legendary poets of sin and debauchery. Fans of the intensity found in Nietzsche and Sade and Blake. Rimbaud, Henry Miller, the Surrealists, Bataille, Paradise Lost, Edgar Allan Poe, of course, Gothic literature of any kind, Tanizaki, Mishima, the usual suspects on this channel. If you liked anything on this channel, then read Baudelaire. I review dark stuff, typically. It's my thing. And this is the origin of a lot of it. Better than food. If you'd like to see more dark French literature reviews this season, then please let me know, because I have a lot of it. Time for the coffee lottery. All right, who's gonna get Baudelaire? For those of you who are new, the coffee lottery is where I take all the names of the patrons who have donated $5 or more on Patreon. I place their names into this mason jar. I pull out a name for every review I do, and I send the person whose name I pull out a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee roasted by yours truly. If you would like to get in on that, you can head to the description box below and click the link and donate $5 or more per video on Patreon, and I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you. $1 or more will get you access to the patron-only vids. Man, I have been drinking. We'll get you access to the patron-only reviews on Patreon. This month I'm reviewing a previously unpublished Ernest Hemingway story. The story is about the end of the war in occupied Paris, and this character based on Hemingway is in this hotel room at the Ritz, drinking champagne and reading Baudelaire and talking about him. And the poem he's reading in the book is actually in this collection of poems. So that's pretty cool. And that's great. So you can check that out if you donate $1 or more on Patreon. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the patrons who have donated. Good luck to everyone. All right, here we go. Jeff, thank you very much for all the help, Jeff. You're going to get Le Fleur de Mal and Selected Poems by Charles Baudelaire. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I'm also on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. A like on Facebook would be greatly appreciated. Great to see you as always. Always remember, die reading. Souviens-toi toujours à mourir en le livre. Did that translate properly in French? If you speak French, I'd love to know if that sounds ridiculous. Maybe it's all the better. Thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves and have a good night. Ciao.